There are a lot of things that are true about me. I like Japanese food. I enjoy the occasional drink. I like strategy games. These are things about myself that I recognize when people point them out. Then there are facts about me that I feel no connection to and don't see myself in. One of those things is that I'm unfortunately British. It's true, I was born in Reading. I went to school at my local comp. I even have the accent. I even have the Brexit blue passport, which I do think looks cooler than the red. But was it worth leaving the European Union over? I'll leave that question for another day. But my point is that I feel more connected to my enjoyment of the cuisine of a country on the other side of the world than to the national identity of the place I've always lived in. It's not to say I've never felt anything at all about it. I get a bit like that when England does well at the football. Maybe not. Maybe I don't take it as far as some British people, but I still enjoy it. And it is mostly nothing, though. Why? I put it down to the difficulty in figuring out who you are when you're a second generation immigrant. For me, there was a lot of shifting one way or the other, only to find that neither identity could ever really be yours. And then it clicked for me. The one time I'd ever really felt this sort of like general nebulous feeling of being British or English, and it was going to the cinema with a couple of friends of mine to watch a movie. And there are a lot of movies set in Britain. There are a lot of movies that are about that try to speak to some essential aspect of Britishness or Englishness or Scottishness or Welshness even. I don't know one off the top of my head that would apply to Welshness. So Welsh people, tell me what films are about your national identity. I have no way of knowing what those would be. But these all speak to different people's experiences, and plenty of them are good movies. And if you think that those films are better than the one I'm about to mention, then that's fine. For me, though, the film that captured the experience of being British, or at least of my experience of it growing up in the 2000s, was a film by comedian Chris Morris called Four Lions. Imagine a late spring day, I'm 16, walking to the cinema with my friends. One was a British Pakistani and the other was a white Brit, and me, the stereotypical bridge between East and West. 'Twas ever thus. If I were to tell you that all three of us were going to enjoy a comedy film about a group of British Muslims in Sheffield trying, and the emphasis really is on trying, to be terrorist, you'd probably wonder how that's possible. Unless you've seen the film. And if you haven't seen it, this is your last chance to go watch it before I spoil it forever for you. All three of us loved the film. We laughed at the same time. We spoke about it pretty excited afterwards, and it really did connect with me in a surprising way. What was it about this film that on paper shouldn't have worked, especially as a comedy, that connected with me and connected me with an identity that I rarely feel anything for? Before we get into a synopsis of the film, it's important we understand the context that spawned it. Four Lions was released in 2010, which means that research and scripting for it must have been taking place in the 2000s. And the thing about the 2000s is there were a lot of high profile acts of terrorism that decade. I mean, obviously 9/11 is the one that will spring to mind, and a lot of the war on terror's downstream effect on America's client states like the UK was a response to that. The UK also had a major domestic terror attack of its own, known as 7/7, which happened in 2005, which the fact I had to look that up tells you how much of a small event it was compared to 9/11, because it didn't really stick in the public consciousness as much. There's not like an industrial remembrance thing about it. If we're talking about the political efforts made to prevent terrorism, at least on paper, 9/11 is really the before or after line in most countries in the global north, rather than 7/7 in Britain. But it's relevant because it made opposition to these laws and criticism of them politically difficult. That doesn't mean people didn't make the point that civil liberties were being infringed and that the state was fucking terrible at actually doing anything about terrorism. It's in this smothering atmosphere of cross-party acceptance of this new order that Four Lions emerged, which brings us to the person who we have to thank for this masterpiece, Chris Morris. If you've heard of Chris Morris, it's probably because of Brass Eye, which, I'll be honest, beyond the occasional screen cap that's used as a meme, it isn't something I watched a lot of. But people think very highly of it. He's one of those British comedy figures that are really venerated for their work, and I think it's interesting that he's not got an online presence, or sort of very deliberately doesn't have one, it seems, which I think has protected him from some of the issues that his contemporaries have, mainly that as time's gone on, they've become more and more reactionary. A lot of them have just decided that it's more important to signal that they're insensitive than actually be funny. I'm probably thinking of quite a few people at this point, but keep that in mind because it will come up again. I was chatting about him with someone when I mentioned I was doing this video, and the word genius came up from them, and while I wouldn't throw that word around lightly, he's got it. Like, whatever it is, he has it. And he pays attention to what precisely and how sensitively he should be satirizing something, and whether there's a point to it. Or in his own words,
I don't really see the point of comedy unless there's something underpinning it. I mean, what are you doing? You know, are you doing some kind of exotic display for the court to be patted on the head by the court, or are you trying to change something?
He also made fun of the weird, uncanny valley android we have in charge of the NHS, Wes Streeting, which, you know, I've got to play you a bit of that because fuck Wes Streeting.
And on his outstretched hand, a tiny little Wes Streeting. Yeah, you could see it was him with his startled bird face. And
all of this to say that before Four Lions, he was already a legend, and part of the reason that this film could even get made was because it had the sheer force of his name and reputation behind it. Part of the reason it needed that force is because of the political background in which the film was made. To put it lightly, the subject matter was tricky. I think it's fair to say tricky because of the ongoing war on terror. In fact, it's still going, so it's probably still tricky. The subject matter could really have gone wrong in a lot of ways. First of all, let's be honest. Comedy about wannabe suicide bombers is a tough pitch. It just is. There's no real way to approach it and treat it with the seriousness it deserves without going to dark places, which the film didn't shy away from, which was a good choice in my view because it would have defeated a lot of the point of making a film about this. If you did a feel-good fake out at the end, like, what's the point? Why are we doing this? Sorry everyone, I just had to adjust my lights there because they were getting really messed up. The second way this could have gone wrong is that the victims of terror attacks like the 7/7 bombings could have kicked off about it. And in and of itself, that's not necessarily something that would be bad for a film like this. No such thing as bad publicity, right? But it's easy to forget the political environment this was all happening in. It would have been entirely plausible that political sympathy for the victims could have been used to clamp down hard on the film, which would have been a shame. It would have really been a shame. In fact, in an interview with Vice, Morris mentions that there were threats to blockade cinemas that were going to show the film on these grounds, but these never materialized. It is interesting just how much Morris mirrored 7/7. I didn't know this before I was doing the sort of background research for this video, but there were 4 perpetrators of the 7/7 bombing, which mirrors the 4 main perpetrators of the bombings in the film, although, you know, questionable how that plays out. But spoiler alert, they do actually manage to do a bit of bombing. I have to imagine this was a deliberate choice, absent any evidence to the contrary, and it really could have tanked the project. The attitude of the time in the mainstream was, this is not a laughing matter, mixed with, if you humanize these people, you're against civilization itself. It's not exactly an easy line to walk, is it? Especially when you consider the other way this could have gone badly wrong. The final way that I'll mention where this could have gone wrong is that it's entirely possible for a film which is a comedy about British Muslim terrorists to come off as Islamophobic. Shocking, I know. I know, I'm the first person who thought of this. Now, I don't think that this would have harmed the prospects of the film, because Britain in the late 2000s and early 2010s would probably have been totally cool with it. In fact, the Britain of today probably would have been totally cool with it. Chris Morris, though, wouldn't have been cool with it. In pretty much every interview that I've read about this, he makes the point that he really didn't want to make a hate film or words to that effect. My view is that if he'd decided to make a film where the joke was Muslims are terrorists, it would have completely missed the mark of what he wanted to do here, which is why that's not the joke. It would have overshadowed his correct position that the practitioners of this cause are composed of human frailty, it would have obscured it completely. If they were a racist stereotype that his contemporaries would likely have gone for, that he was able to thread these needles as a testament to something we'll be talking about later, his sensitivity to the topic and the communities involved, but also knowing his shit and what precisely he wanted to satirize. It's not an accident that the butt of the joke is often Britain's bloated and ineffective anti-terror apparatus, and believe me, it's not got better since. In the film, we spend our time with 5 wannabe terrorists, and we get a lot of insight into who they are and a little bit of a peek into their lives. Some more than others, but it's fair to say we get a decent idea of who these people are and their group dynamic. You know, beyond them clearly being kind of lonely people latching onto each other looking for friends, which is really the most human thing of all when you think about it. The character we spend the most time with, and the main candidate for protagonist of this film, is Omar, played by Riz Ahmed, who you might know from Rogue One, apparently. I'd forgotten he was in that, and I actually quite like Rogue One, so that's on me, everyone. He is the leader of the group, even if he at times has to deal with challenges to that authority from Barry, who we will be talking about because, oh my god, Barry is the whole thing. He's probably by some margin the most skeptical of the characters other than Wadge about what they're trying to do. Not because of some moral objection, he believes he's on solid ground there, but because of how ridiculous his compatriots are. His motivations for doing this are perhaps the ones that will resonate the most with people who have a political memory of the 2000s, namely that the West keeps on intervening in Muslim-majority countries to devastating effect, and he has a general criticism of Western society. A lot of the time his criticisms are framed in terms of excessive consumption. I'm also pretty sure he directly name drops capitalism as an issue. In other words, he's the kind of guy who, if he was raised in or just generally had a more secular outlook, could have been making YouTube videos like this in the year 2025. These criticisms, if you're a regular viewer, will probably feel a little familiar, and it's not a surprise that the character who's fought this through the most has those criticisms. It's just that Omar has veered wildly in the wrong direction. He's also the character who we get the most insights into his life. Almost immediately, we see that he has a family that he genuinely loves and cares for, and I'll touch on this a bit more, but it's a really humanizing thing to show us that this person who's planning to do something awful has the same capacity for familial love as the rest of us. It's great, and it perversely kind of makes you root for Omar. The fortunes of the group really do impact Omar the most, where most of the lads stayed the course no matter what, either through being a weird loser, being kind of dim-witted, or just being Barry. Omar's journey is the one that's the most fleshed out as our protagonists, and he has to contend with his brother who believes in a more pacifist theory of practicing conservative Islam. A thing that a lot of Morris's contemporaries wouldn't have even considered depicting, and also feels very authentic. Like, I can't speak for Pakistani or South Asian Muslims in the UK, but there are absolutely Turkish religious conservatives in the UK who come across exactly like Omar's brother, and his reading group, and just, yeah, it rings true, even down to the apparently more radical Omar and his wife making fun of his brother for locking his wife in a little room. Omar, his family, and his relationship with how he wants to tackle these issues that he's seen in the world, which were real then and are real now, expresses a depth and humanity that it would have been easy to just smother under Muslims are all terrorists bits. Speaking of weird racists, Barry is probably the most iconic character in the film. If you look the film up on YouTube, virtually all of the most viewed or easy to find clips feature Barry in a major role. As an aside here, Nigel Lindsay, who plays Barry, plays Levy in HBO's Rome, and I only realized this on a recent rewatch of Rome, that it was him playing him, and he just plays Jewish Barry in that show, and it's really funny that he's basically played the same character twice in things I really enjoy. Barry is probably as close as we get to an antagonist that isn't the British state, although I wouldn't rule out that he is some kind of state asset, to be honest. He regularly clashes with and challenges Omar for leadership of the group, and is the one who has the most inflated sense of their group's importance and his personal importance, which, yeah, he has a big head. Just trust me on that.
You realise if I don't come with you to Pakistan, bro, Islam is finished.
It's also interesting that the white British convert is the loudest one in the group, both figuratively and literally, the most aggressive while insisting on the most counter-surveillance measures. Also, he punches himself in the face to justify one of the worst ideas for a false flag in history, which is their idea to bomb a mosque, which tracks with what Chris Morris says about Barry being based on a BNP guy who read the Quran in order to own Muslims in debate and ended up converting, which is, whew, yeah. I gotta say, one of the funniest stories related to the BNP, not gonna lie. It also goes some way to explaining his open racism. He uses slurs, he's anti-Semitic, and honestly doesn't seem to like Muslims very much. As much as he criticizes the West in broad terms, he has specific disdain for mainstream Muslims, which again tracks with the whole BNP origin, not just because white fascists hate Muslims, which they do, but because disdain for traitors, especially race traitors, is pretty integral to the whole worldview. He also is the most Barry person in history. If you're British, you will know what I mean when I talk about a guy down the pub who sounds like he knows what he's talking about, but is in fact a complete dipshit. I usually call that person in videos either Barry or Gary down the pub. That's Barry. He's the jihadi down the pub. He's a great character and a fantastic antagonist to Omar because he is relentlessly committed to what the group is doing no matter what. The third character we spend a lot of time with is Waj, played by Kaivan Novak, who you'll almost certainly know as Nandor the Relentless in What We Do in the Shadows, or if you're my age, you'll know him as the Phone Jacker guy, which is a pretty impressive trajectory when you think about it. But in Waj, we have the closest thing to a purely good character in the group. Yes, Waj is not the brightest bulb, and that's used a lot for comic relief, like when he's yelling at chickens and calling them rabbits, or taking selfies to check if he's making his confused face. Beneath it all, though, is a character who's trying and wants to believe he's doing the right thing. He places a lot of trust in Omar, which does lead to these really dark moments where Omar is clearly manipulating him, in the same way that Barry manipulates members of the group. It's dark. It's maybe not something that would be played in the same way these days, but as I said, the whole subject matter is dark. It doesn't feel out of place. Waj's naivety draws a stark contrast with Barry and Omar, who are really trying to at least project that they're worldly and they know the right thing to do. Waj's uncertainty is often played off as he's stupid, and to be honest, the character is not an intellectual, to say the least. It does add a nice dimension to the group. He even explicitly says he thinks what they're doing is wrong, before Omar manipulates and confuses him. He helps to remind us that these are not the good guys. We might sympathize with them on a personal level. We might find their farcical moments funny, but they're still awful. The last of the original four is Faisal, or Faisal. The subtitles say one thing and the credits say another. And honestly, they say Faisal in the film, so I'm going to call him Faisal, even though it's Faisal. He's kind of Barry's Waj in a way, though where Barry is an exaggeration in every way, Faisal is like a more toned-down Waj. He's just a little naive. He's not, like, outwardly stupid. He's trained crows to deliver bombs, which is cruel to the crows, but it is clever. I don't think Waj could pull that off. His position in the crew is that he is kind of the weakest link until Hassan joins. The particular highlight is Faisal's adventures in buying 12 bottles of bleach over and over again, which he blags really badly and manages to get caught out by Barry, of all people. Faisal has a bit of a mishap partway through the film, and so isn't one of the final four, but we do get little insights into his life. We hear a lot about his dad, who eats moss and sees creatures that aren't there, and every indication is that he takes care of his dad. He's also very much part of the crew, though he doesn't really shine through given most of the serious action belongs to Omar, and the comic relief is occupied by Barry and Wadj and the final protagonist, Hassan. Hassan is introduced in one of the funniest scenes in the film, which also kind of highlights how much this shouldn't have worked. Barry is mouthing off at some public meeting, and Hassan does a fake suicide bombing while rapping. Like I said, it really shouldn't work, but it is very funny. And Barry recruits him, and this understandably upsets Omar, who is less concerned about having mates and more concerned about, like, actually doing terrorism. Hassan's whole deal is he just seems like he needs friends and almost blows the group's cover by dancing with their oblivious neighbor. He goes through Barry's fake hazing rituals, and he voluntarily offers up his dad's vans and costumes for the group's schemes. Unlike Faisal, he does make it to the final act, but bottles it, resulting in Barry murdering him. See, I told you it was dark. In fact, every character bottles it or has a wobble except for Barry, I think in part because the real jihad was the friends we made along the way. Also because these people aren't like irredeemable monsters. In the film and in real life, the people who do these things are real people with the same capacity for moral thought that we have. I think to some extent, that's what makes so much of this feel dark. Who knows what we might resort to if we felt that degree of alienation from everything around us. Before we really dig into the film's portrayal of Britishness and how that works, I'll do you a quick synopsis of the film so you get the broad strokes of what happens if you've not watched it or you need a reminder. I think this synopsis will really illustrate why this shouldn't have worked, but Chris Morris really pulls it off by just being kind of normal about it. We're introduced to our crew with some homemade videos where they immediately fly into their bickering before we see that Omar is in fact a family man with a normal, boring job. He suddenly gets the call to go to a training camp and goes off with Wadj to Pakistan, where they're hilariously out of their depth. This results in what we'll call friction with their superior at the training camp, and in Omar firing a rocket launcher backwards and killing Bin Laden. No, seriously, that is revealed in the credits. He kills Bin Laden. Barry decides it's a good idea as a terrorist to be going to public panels and recruits Hassan, which moves swiftly into Barry's 5D chess move. He suggests a false flag attack on a mosque, which just shows how out there he gets when Omar's not around. Speaking of which, Omar and Wadj make it back from Pakistan, and Barry immediately figures out that they fucked it, but is overawed by the lie Omar tells, which is that they have an emir for their attack. A lie that results in them using a Club Penguin knockoff called Puffin Party for terrorist communications, and for Wadj to express how hurt he is by Omar after he blows up, if you'll pardon the pun, at them following Faisal's accident, resulting in him taking out a sheep, or as Barry puts it, attacking the infrastructure. That's what he did, he attacked the infrastructure. Eventually, the gang makes up, settles on the London Marathon as their target, and each of the remaining 4 characters blow up with varying degrees of agency and effectiveness. Hassan bottles it and is murdered by Barry. Wadj is talked into it by Omar, and while Omar tries to talk him out of it, Barry swallows his SIM card. It's a long story, but the swallowing SIM card thing is a whole thing in this film. And ends up blowing up because of someone doing the Heimlich on him. Following a breakdown of negotiations with Benedict Cumberbatch, yes, really, Wadj blows up a kebab shop called Kebabish, which I find interesting because there was a Kebabish in Reading when I was growing up, and now I'm wondering if it was a chain of some kind. Anyway, Omar, utterly heartbroken by Wadj's death, does the one thing he didn't want to do and blows up a pharmacy. In the credits, we get little glimpses of the aftermath, including Omar's brother about to be tortured by Egyptians on British soil, Omar's workmate defending him to the last, which, you know, we all need a ride or die, right? Some extra clips of the lads, and I think the ultimate summary of just how shit the British state is, but I'm gonna have to save that clip for later, because trust me, if I put it here, it's gonna diminish how awesome it is later. So now we're all on the same page about the broad strokes, let's dig into exactly how all of this works, and what it has to do with my angsty adolescent identity crisis. The first and most obvious point that allows this film to capture a sense of Britishness that I relate to is it's set in Britain. Now, you might be about to furiously type a sarcastic response to that, but let me explain. Let me explain myself here. Yes, there are lots of films set in Britain or that have scenes in Britain. Like, this third Sonic movie has several scenes set in Britain. It doesn't connect me with some sense of Britishness because Sonic the Hedgehog trying to bypass a barrier that will disintegrate him has nothing to do with it, right? Which is kind of my point. The choice of setting it in Sheffield, no offense to anyone from there, but it's not exactly like the UK's biggest draw for tourism. It was a bit odd at the time when I first watched it that three southern suburban kids really connected with this. In retrospect, it's not so odd, and I'll go over some key ways this became an all-England affair. But also there's something in how southern English people think about the North and Northerners and think that they are somehow by default more authentically representative of a type of Englishness. It's why certain politicians, who I won't name here, really lean into their regional accents, even if they're not from the North. That's a topic for another time, but setting this in Sheffield is probably not where I would have done it. It's why Chris Morris is the comedy legend, and I'm doing this. It's major enough that everyone would have heard of it, but it isn't where a lot of us would have stereotypically imagined this kind of story taking place. If you'd asked most southern English people where to set this, they'd say London or Birmingham. And part of that's because those places are near to where they would live, and that stereotypically these places also have large Muslim populations. By going against that actually helps foster this sense of a shared identity, because it turns out they have the same shit we do up in Sheffield. I mean, I definitely know that for sure now, because I've been to Sheffield since then. And I live a lot closer to Sheffield now than I do to my hometown. And it feels obvious, but trust me, it kind of helps. In the first scene where they're doing their terrorist clips for the news, when Omar is going off on one about consumerism, and I think it's McDonald's he's criticising, Wadge just barges in and starts talking about it being more value for money to go to Chicken Cottage. Now, where I grew up and where I live now, we don't have a Chicken Cottage, but I 100% know what he's talking about. The equivalent where I grew up would be the legendary Mr. Cod, and if Mr. Cod would like to sponsor me or this channel, I'm very open to that. Just saying, I will take payment in chicken wings. This is just one example of the cultural points of reference throughout. If you're not British, the part where Omar asks if Faisal is a martyr or a Jalfrezi may go over your head, because I don't know if Jalfrezi's gone international. So it's not just set in Britain, it's happening in a Britain that I've existed in. One of my favourite lines is Waz just shouting out, "Fuck Mini Baby Bells," which is very funny, but also how dare he? First of all, Mini Baby Bells are awesome. The content of all of the bickering they do does feel very you and your mates are bored and just picking fights, which is a more humanizing aspect, but also just like, come on, like we haven't just had enough of our friends and called them dickheads. A final one I'll mention is Barry's car constantly breaking down. Absolutely does remind me of a friend of mine whose car was notoriously a piece of shit, and we would taunt him the same way Omar does to Barry, asking him if he fixed it himself, and it wound him right up. Now, my friend wasn't an ex-BNP Muslim convert, but I don't know, it still lands the same for me. Also, when they put Barry in the boot of the car, I do have a story to tell. Story time with SK here. But I want to say we didn't tie him up and throw him in the boot, but a bunch of friends of mine were visiting this same friend, and he still lives in rural England, and he took us in his car, a new one, not the one we made fun of, to the local supermarket, and we ended up buying so much stuff that we basically had to put someone in the boot of the car, and it ended up being him. And I do remember the police driving by us, so like you could see into the boot and he was clearly sitting in it, and they drove by us, didn't care, didn't give a shit. I guess it was the benefits of being a group of nice young men with their girlfriends out on a day out visiting a friend. Shout out to that friend. I don't think he watches these videos, but I know one friend who was there definitely does. Shout out to him as well. This is something that solidifies how British the protagonists, but especially Wadge and Omar are, but it's also something that relates pretty directly to my personal experience. And it's implied throughout that these guys are second-generation immigrants, apart from Barry, obviously, or at least something like that. When they go to Pakistan, they're immediately and very obviously out of their depth. It's a feeling that I've had when I visited Turkey. It's a feeling that if you're a second generation immigrant, you've most probably felt in some way. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I don't think anyone watching this has gone to a terrorist training camp. I'm just rolling those dice here. That being said, I've absolutely been on the receiving end of an extended rant for not handling myself precisely as expected that had the same vibes and references when they get shouted at by their trainer at the camp. It's easy to be alienated in the country you were born in because there's this contingent of white British people who will never let you forget that you're not really British, you know? Like, you have the accent, you have the same cultural points of reference, but come on, you're really Turkish or Pakistani or wherever else your parents might be from. Then you might go looking to see if that's an option for you, but because you're so British or English, it just doesn't work. That culture also doesn't embrace you in the same way, and for me, I ended up just sort of going for, well, I guess I'm a citizen of the world then, and maybe that created a bit of that wanderlust in me. I really want to go see the world a little bit. But the characters in the film, especially Omar, seem to double down on needing to act to resolve this. And I get it. I've been there. I'm sure some of you have been there, and none of us ended up becoming terrorists about it. You just go through what you need to go through. But that's how this happens. A lot of British people don't get it when you explain it to them. But some of them, when they watch this, they might think it makes a bit more sense. It reminds me of when ISIS was still a thing, and there was a journalist reporting on it, and I forget who it was, and I'll try and find the source. This is pure, like, drawing it. It might have been revealed to me in a dream. But they expected to meet, like, hardened Mujahideen fighters from the local area in places like Chechnya and Afghanistan. And instead, most of what he encountered were, like, terrified office workers from France who were on speed. If you're wondering where those people come from, it's from this double alienation. Of course, like I said, most of us settle on a healthier relationship to both identities and the wider world, but some don't, and some people struggle with it their whole lives. If I summed up this series of thoughts, it's just that these guys are British lads you'd meet in real life, even down to the farcical stuff. A lot of the comedy is very much in the mold of British comedy, which you'd expect given who made it, but it just lands and it lends this extra layer of credibility to it all. The loud bickering, the part where they try to get Barry to punch himself in the face, it's all so familiar. The main scene I think absolutely captures this is the part where they're driving down to London and they're all singing Dancing in the Moonlight, which oddly did feel like it was a song that everyone recognized and knew once upon a time, which is weird because I can't remember ever seeking out the song myself, and yet I'm pretty sure I could sing it, like, just from memory. I just love that scene. There's something universal in singing with your friends. It's not a unique quality to Britain, of course, but I just love it. It's super humanizing, like so many aspects of this film. The film does have this humanizing and sensitive streak within it, particularly aided by the performance of Riz Ahmed as Omar. The thing that works so well is both these are just fine British lads that you'd find anywhere aspect, and the fact that a lot of the time spent with the characters are either them living their lives, which are quite boring. Like, Omar has a boring job with a boring colleague, which is just the most real shit. One of the first scenes is him with his wife and kid. We see Omar read his son a story and kind of seek forgiveness or justification for his lie to his friends, and I love his Lion Kingification of his fuck up in Pakistan. It's funny. We hear about Faisal's dad and the issues he's having, like eating moss, which, can I just say, it can't be good for you. Like, it just cannot be. There's this great moment where Omar's wife and Omar and his brother have a fight with water pistols, and it's just a really sweet moment where these people aren't hardened monsters. They're every bit as complex and human as us, and this humane treatment of them allows us to let our guard down. Yeah, they're not good guys broadly, but there are bad guys. It's interesting how this effect is achieved with some dedicated scenes, but also with throwaways where they show how much they know each other. Like, in the credits, Hassan mugs off Waj for liking Maroon 5, which, yeah, come on. Really? Regardless of how I feel about Maroon 5, it's interesting that we end up knowing that about Waj, isn't it? It's important to note that none of the jokes about the characters or that are made in the film are about anything inherent to the characters. It would have been very easy to make a film where the joke was Muslims are terrorists and to make that the basis of everything. It didn't happen here, and part of the reason why is I think Chris Morris realized that this community, this religion, has incredible diversity across it. Like, there are Muslims who openly drink alcohol, like I know some, and there are some who are much more conservative on that issue. I also know some of them. To give an example there, you even see it in the film. Omar's brother is actually much more conservative on women than Omar. The inspiration for this partially comes from Chris Morris reading about terrorism and realizing a lot of it is farcical. And where there's farce, there's comedy. And he makes this a very British farce. There's nothing in here that would be out of place with an all-white British cast. You change some of the dressing, you might change the references, but goading your friend into punching himself in the face or firing a rocket launcher backwards is funny no matter what religion or ethnicity you are. This sensitivity, this desire to not make it about hating a group actually makes the comedy funnier, and that might feel counterintuitive to some of you who like other British comedians, like my fellow Readingensian, and yes, that is the term for someone from Reading, Ricky Gervais. If one of Morris's less sensitive and frankly less talented contemporaries had taken this kind of thing on, firstly, I doubt it gets made. Secondly, it would probably verge on a hate film. There's a school of thought in comedy, or expressed by comedians, I should say, to be more clear, that goes a little something like this. As a comedian, I need to be able to joke about anything. No one is saying you can't make jokes about whatever topic you want. What people are saying is, you're not funny, and you're not funny because you're going out of your way to be a dick about it. Chris Morris took up the challenge that I issue to comedians, which is if you think your material about a particular marginalized community is funny, then perform it or show it to them. If they laugh, you've done it. And British Muslims, in my strictly anecdotal experience, seem to like this film. They like it because, despite the subject matter being primed to offend, it just works. And that's because he actually took the time to be sensitive to the community, or at least the broadest possible section that he could. As Chris Morris found out, there's not really such a thing as a monolithic Muslim community. Nonetheless, this film reaches a lot of us with connections to it because these people who go on to do horrible things are part of our country as well, part of our society. That's the thing this film shows. You can be sensitive and thoughtful and funny because there's lots to make fun of. You just need to not be a dick about it, Ricky. Yes, I'm directing this to Ricky Gervais now. Fuck you. One final thing I'll say that really humanizes these guys and shows them not as caricatures but as believable people is that apart from Barry, who's off the deep end and is a bit of a caricature, if we're honest, he's the only one who's really approaching that. Each of them has their doubts and their wobbles. A particularly funny one is Fessel being asked by Barry whether he's decided, well, he's basically telling him, you've decided to blow yourself up already. And him being so unsure that he actually shows his face to the camera, an act that he considers haram. Like, he's so shaken by the question, it's such a big thing that he has to take off his box that he wears on his head when he's on cameras. He just sets aside his concerns about images, and we get to see his face on the dodgy camcorder Barry uses. It's just so surreal. It wouldn't be one of my videos if we didn't at least get into the politics a tiny bit, and so we're going to do a little tiny bit of it. One of the things I find interesting is that a lot of the complaints the characters have, they're not totally alien to those of us who were around in the late 2000s. I mean, I was a kid. I was a teenager in the late 2000s, so I was getting the downstream sort of like teenager version of it, with early internet, that sort of thing. Well, early-ish internet. We're way past the early internet. But it was odd how familiar so much of it is and still feels, and that's because we're still living in the war on terror, partially because it's a war that can never end, but that feels like a topic that deserves a video all on its own, to give a non-exhaustive list of the things various members of the group talk about. Omar repeatedly criticizes consumerism, mentions the issue of Gaza and Palestine. Actually, Barry also mentions it, although Barry is anti-Semitic about it because, you know, he's Barry. One of the recurring themes is the idea of the group being monitored, and Barry literally chants about there being a police state, which, yeah, kind of, right? One of the jokes people used to make at the time and still make is about being put on lists, and I don't think we make that joke without being aware that there's some kind of apparatus that could put us there. By the way, hello to my GCHQ officer. Oh, that is literally a bit Barry does in the film, where he goes morning officer to a woman pushing her pram, though that's more a manifestation of his paranoia than a coherent worldview or a joke in a YouTube video. The thing is, they actually are being monitored, and it's confirmed by the film, by the footage the news gets of Fessel with his crows, but also at various points the camera used is clearly like surveillance footage of the crew and of Omar's brother's house before they get raided, which we will talk about in a second. But oh my, there is a lot going on there. Another issue that recurs and is hinted at is people assuming that Muslims are terrorists, which was and is absolutely a thing, and it's something people have a right to be angered by, as are a lot of the issues that they raise. Capitalism, conspicuous consumerism, colonialism, foreign wars, and a heavy-handed surveillance state. They're all things that make our lives worse, no matter who we are, unless we're capitalists. And even then, I think there's a case to be made that it's not doing them a lot of favors if you just look at how some of them are behaving. One interesting thing is that the British state and its agents are routinely even more incompetent than the lads. There are two main points, but the first one I want to talk about is the hilarious bickering between the snipers, which the film makes a point of showing you as they get to the marathon. They're bickering about whether a Wookiee is a bear. No, it's not, by the way, but it really is like that sometimes. The first incident that I really want to talk about is the raid on Omar's brother. Now, he might actually hold more of an extreme ideology than Omar. For example, he keeps his wife in a separate room. The thing is, he's committed to interpersonal nonviolence. Yes, his ideology would rely on a lot of violence to enforce, but so far as the law is concerned, he's not actually doing anything wrong. Yet he gets raided, and Omar's wife is questioned about it at the hospital when Omar does his little farewell to her. He's even taken to a shipping container that's legally Egypt in the credits, and it's good that it's shown here. The British state is really bad at actually figuring out who's doing what. Often they know who people are, and then they just kind of let them do their thing anyway. I think this is what happened, people can correct me in the comments, with the Manchester Arena bombing in 2017. The perpetrator was known to British police, but wasn't considered a threat for some reason. In a way, this film really shows how this could happen, because they just look for the wrong things. A committed pacifist with a very conservative, and I would say bad interpretation of a religion, is not a terrorist. He's a debate bro. And while I think debate bros are a plague upon the land, should they be jailed under anti-terror legislation? I think I'll leave that one for others to decide. I'm not ready to weigh in on that one just yet. The second and funnier incident is Wadge's encounter with the hostage negotiator Ed, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, and yes, I have to confirm, it is really him. I just couldn't believe this was the first place I saw him. But he's trying to negotiate with Wadge and ends up talking about girls and managed to end up implying to Wadge, who was misunderstanding, that he was gay, which obviously did not work as a negotiating tactic, you will be surprised to know. This results in Nabil, the guy working at Kebabish, getting shot. Classic kebab shop name, by the way. We had one in Reading when I was growing up, and now I kind of want to know if it was a chain or something. If you know, tell me in the comments. Tell me whether Kebabish was a chain or not, because I really, really need to know now. Really, all of this is summed up in the credits, where the state is washing its hands of its responsibility, and in the line delivered by the MP from Barry's public appearance, where he meets Hassan. In the credits, he just delivers this line that just sums it all up.
The report makes crystal clear that the police shot the right man, but as far as I'm aware, the wrong man exploded. Is that clear?
And that really does say everything that needs to be said about that. I think about this film a lot more than other ones I watched at that time. Even though it's clearly set in a Britain that no longer exists, I still really connect to it. Those issues and tensions still exist for me, but I've matured a little, and in part I've matured a bit because of a film like this being made. That 2000s Britain I grew up in feels like a foreign country every time I watch this film. Yeah, there are some cultural references that I find familiar. Like, Barry mentions YouTube, but that was before YouTube was like YouTube, you know? I do genuinely feel this pang of sadness at the ending of the film, because even though the main characters are bad guys, the film does this amazing job of settling them in their time, and you feel sad both for the Britain that created them and for them. Like, they got to achieve what they set out to do, and it still feels like food turning to ash in your mouth. Maybe I feel sad because that Britain is one I connected to, and now Britain is just a place that I live. Like, my friends are here, I speak the language, but it doesn't, speak to me the same way. I don't desire to be part of it as much, and that's the enduring relevance of the film. These lads, these four lions, they went through it all the same. I think Omar's character must be around my age now, and you can still feel it. You can deny it, you can try to work on it, as I do, but it does still exist, and knowing this film is there if I want to go back to it is oddly reassuring, and that's what secures its legacy in my view. It's a sensitive work, and the comedy is almost background noise to what it's trying to say, but it works, and I'm glad it works. I also do want to respond to something that I think Riz Ahmed said in an interview with Vice about the film in 2020. I don't know if he's changed his mind or addressed it later. It's entirely possible, but he posed this idea that this film wouldn't get made today by Chris Morris because of woke and because of what was then called Twitter, because people would take issue with a white middle-class British guy doing this. And I think that's both an uninteresting question, would this be made today? And I think it also diminishes this film's place. Like, would this be made today is a boring question often asked by bores. What's interesting is, if this was made today, how would it be different? And the truth is, if Chris Morris tried again today, I think he's still one of the few people who could pull it off. But it'd be much harder, not because of like some woke, looming wokeness, but because arts funding and the space needing to pull this off wouldn't be there. If it was made at all today, I fear it would be an offensive film, which is why I'm glad it was made the way it was when it was. Chris Morris did everything right that, woke people would ask of it. Of course, people would criticize, but you could make this today if you had the funding, if you had the backing. And I hope people do watch films like this and feel inspired to make their own art. It absolutely would have found its audience, and there's so much comedy out there to be made about even dark topics like this if we just approach them with a little thought and a tiny bit of kindness. That's the thing about the film. It's kind to its protagonists when they don't necessarily deserve it. Riz Ahmed kind of disproved himself in his own sort of monologue where he says Chris involved Muslims in every part of the process. Exactly. That's why people would love it now. If you've got here and you've not watched it, give it a go. It's truly a film worthy of your time. And with that, all I have to say is, Rubber-Dingy Rapids, bro. Take it easy. I need to thank my proofreader who has never watched Four Lions and was not persuaded to watch it by the script, which feels like a failure on my part, and also Malto, who made the thumbnail. You can check Malto out in the description. I'll have a link to her Ko-fi. Go commission her. She made this excellent thumbnail. And I also need to thank my patrons and members. If you want the videos a day early, if you want to vote on the topic of videos, if you want to suggest topics to me, all of the good stuff, all of the good bonus stuff, there's even a super secret bit of the Discord, then head on over to patreon.com/SKTheCrusader or join here on YouTube. Either way, you'll get some really nice bonus action. And also remember to like, comment, subscribe, all the good stuff. But now that shout out, special shout out to Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kersley Scheider, John N, and Liron, who are the top tier patrons. absolute legends, and to our YouTube members, Nadir Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, and Scaly Bubble. With that, everyone, I will catch you all on the next one. Take it easy. I really wish I had a Rubber Dinghy Rapids shirt and not a Blink-182 one for this, but it'll have to do.